Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We will now soon begin the panel discussion titled Understanding Varieties of Peace in Asia. This session is moderated by Dr. Michelle Ann Miller, the Advisory Board of National University of Singapore and Varieties of Peace. I invite Dr. Miller to come to the stage.
Hi everyone, welcome to the final session for today. I am the moderator for this Understanding Varieties of Peace in Asia panel. My name is Michelle Miller and I'm at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. And it's so nice to be back at the CSIS, where I spent time as a visiting scholar in 2000 while doing work on the Aceh peace process here, and the CSIS was so welcoming by providing such a supportive platform and great networks for conducting interviews. So it feels like coming full circle in a way to be back at an event about varieties of peace in this place that's so excellent at supporting scholars who are doing work on peace. Today in our panel, our speakers will be talking for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll be opening up the floor to discussion. And I'm going to follow the program in terms of the order of names. So our first speaker, Professor Miriam Coronel Ferreira from the University of Philippines, was the peace negotiator in the Mindanao peace process. Please speak.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to join you. I'm afraid, though, that I won't be able to stay for the rest of the conference, and I'm glad that I have access to the papers, which I found all very interesting. I read some of these yesterday. States may be weak or dysfunctional, but they are there. There are institutional structures that have kept them together, whether it's a military institution that has played a very significant role for the longest time, or dominant political parties that have, sort of consolidated their hold over the state, or some state-society ties that bound them and has sustained the state for better or for worse. Like in our case, that's probably in the Philippines, where I come from. That's probably the case, the business, the oligarchy, the business, state ties, the clans, the dynasties, and so on. So as such, much of the state restructuring that is required of peace processes depended on the nature of structural change or institutional reform considered by the state and won by its challengers. So there's that kind of push and pull over as to the extent of institutional reform needed to be able to stand in context. Even take the case of Cambodia, which I suppose is really covered by your Varieties of Peace research, since you're dealing with the 1990s peace agreement. Despite a weak and unformed state, which was the state of Cambodia, or the People's Republic of Kampuchea at the time, that eventually became the leading party, the CPP, the Cambodian People's Party, has been able to retain its dominance. I mean, it was a very weak state, but in the transition, it was able to survive, and in fact, it was able to dominate powers again, by playing and maneuvering, manipulating the new rules of the game, while other elites didn't manage so well. We had an occasion to meet with Prime Minister Hun Sen in 1997, shortly after the coup. And at that time, he said he was contemplating a Malaysian style of political arrangement where you have a set of coalition parties that are bonded together and has kept the dominance. But as you can see, in the case of Cambodia, it's basically a single dominant party that is now in charge, very much in charge, several decades after that transition. And the second case, of course, will be East Timor, where you had the most thorough state reconstruction, but did very little to undermine the Indonesian state that went about its own reform process without East Timor. In fact, letting go of East Timor provided, more space for it to be able to undertake reformasi. And I'm very much reminded of one poster that I saw in one Indonesian NGO, still at the time when the conflict was with East Timor was still there. And it said, the slogan was, "Free Indonesia from East Timor," which is really turning around the table that Indonesia will be better off without East Timor. East Timor, in any case, had wide parameters for structuring the state, but even so, it faced challenges from those who were left behind by the process, thus the need for to further democratize post-independence. Now, I will go through cases that were severely confined within existing constitutional frameworks, which to a certain extent reflect that kind of an institutional variable, such as the constitutions and all the politics behind these constitutions. We know very well that rebel groups are very much averse to constitutions. They will refuse to negotiate within the framework of the existing constitution, which they are subverting by their very nature as an armed group opposing the state. But what we find, for instance, in terms of looking at the limits to the structural change, is that in the case of the MNLF, MILF, and even Aceh, we saw this kind of parameters that define the kind of institutional change that happened. In Aceh, I think we heard from Pahasan earlier about the difficulty of accommodating the last-minute demand to allow local parties to be to contest the elections at the provincial level, because they were basically national parties, and then of course the allowing Sharia law, Sharia courts to be instituted within the province. In the case of the MNLF, Moro National Liberation Front, where Pahasan was part of the talks, and in the case of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which is the other Moro group in southern Philippines, where I was the government negotiator, and we signed the agreement in 2014, what we find was that it was very difficult. Of course, the first step was to do away with the independence demand, but if we had to confine the parameters for the new autonomous regime, the government that was to be instituted, still within the framework of the 1987 Constitution, which to a certain extent allowed for greater parameters for decentralization, as well as recognizing regional autonomy as something that is a right of in the south, where the Moro Muslim population live, and also in the north, which you might say is not the case in the very unitary constitution of Aceh. But in any case, it also constrained the kind of autonomous arrangement that was made possible. In our negotiation, one of the most difficult point of contention was the fact that they wanted a different form of government, which is a parliamentary form of government, as against the presidential form of government that we find in the rest of the state. But we thought we were able to accept that in the belief that by reading the Constitution, it allowed for that kind of flexibility. So there were others, but still it was not possible to give them a sub-state arrangement that already bordered along the lines of a federal state. And then you have the extreme case of Thailand, where any talk of decentralization and autonomy are still taboo, despite the fact that in their 1997 constitution, this was already taken into account. But 1997 constitution is already history, seeing how things eventually evolve in in Thailand, with the military coming back to power and one other constitution, several other constitutions having taken place since then. So what do we conclude from all of this? One is to just try to make it a simple statement. The varieties of peace are deeply linked to the varieties of democratization that are taking shape, whether we refer to democratization as economic, political, social, and even in the global context. And the kind of democratization, the possibilities for reform and democratization constrain or open up the space precisely for a new the kind of peace that could emerge out of, say, a political process, such as peace negotiations. And to that extent, what is quite alarming is the fact that there is a de-democratization going on in the region with the resurgence of tyrannical, security-focused regimes coupled with idiosyncratic leaders, which risk undermining most of these democratic gains that began 70s, 90s, and onwards. I don't really have much time, but I just want to point to another aspect, which is that the narratives also matter. The state ideology vis-a-vis the counter-ideology that are advocated by the counter-elites, the anti-state forces. And at the end of the day, again, it is the kind of synthesis between these narratives, the dominant state narrative and the counter-state narratives, the kind of syntheses that emerge from this, whether in fact they end up to be more inclusive or are precisely still contained within the dominant ethnocentric view of the state, which, for instance, we find surprisingly in a lot of Buddhist majority countries nowadays, implying the fact that this is not a problem only with one religion. So we do have the case of Myanmar, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, where that kind of ethno-religious nationalism is constraining the evolution of a more inclusive synthesis for the narrative of the peoples or the narrative of the state that will prevail. So again, a last conclusion will be that the varieties of narratives of the conflict, the alternative vision, the desired peace, and their synthesis or non-synthesis produce the varieties of peace that we are seeing in the region. I think I will end here because I've used up my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam. Our next speaker, Sunil Bastian, is on the Varieties of Peace Advisory Board.
Thank you. Well, I think it was in a weak moment of my phone call with someone, I agreed to be on this panel. So what I thought was, I have spent whole my life working on Sri Lanka, and also I have worked as a researcher, mainly in a non-governmental research institute. And second, I've been an advisor to international donors. No, I don't have slides. Yeah. International donors, and then also for the last 40 years, now we are called civil society activists. But when I started, we never used that term. We just want to be politically involved and didn't want to be a part of party and got involved in various activities. From all these three, I thought I'll take my basic researcher's hat. And what I'm trying to do is share from the experience of Sri Lanka, which I know empirically quite well, certain general concepts, general ideas, which can be useful for the Varieties of Peace Research Conference, and also useful to be applied and looked at in many other places. And three concepts through which my presentation is state formation, history, and history of ideas. Now, first point is, actually state is studied by many people as a very static entity, static self-contained entity. Many disciplines treat state as if it is a given, is formed. But I would urge to look at state formation as a product of history, product of social processes, subject to change, subject to evolve, although in the post-Cold War period, one of the biggest things happened was Soviet Union breaking down into 15 states. But this absorbing of state, looking at state as a much more evolving entity that changes, evolves, so on, is very not. Even sometimes the state building narrative of the donors, at the back, there's some idea of a very static concept. One thing we learned in Sri Lanka is very well, you need to go back to looking at how our state came into being. Actually, some of the best contributions are now by the historians. And when you do that, you realize that even the word, now Sri Lankans use the word island. Now if you look at when did this word, people began to think of island as a unified entity, it was in the British period. Before that, that was not there. In fact, this is without any social history, study of social history. This is just looking at macro level archival document. So there's a very good book by a Cambridge historian called Islanded, which explores this work. Then one of the first things we learned about this, about the history of state formation, the idea of the state. Now, the singular nationalists, singular Buddhists, basically what happened was they absorbed they appropriate the idea of the state that came from the colonial period and made it their own. So there's an ideology that is linking the state, land, and the religion. Very strong, has been constructed over the years. And we also learn that identities, now if you look at the earlier period, identities, ethnic identities was called communalism. Communalism was a bad word. You shouldn't be communal. You should transform yourselves to be a modern state, right? Where we all become nations, nation state. Classic nation state concept that was brought from Europe. I have looked at lot of historical data to see how this came into being. Unfortunately, still that is very dominant. Although even when we speak now, some of our identity groups are changing their identity. For example, plantation workers who have come from estate, now they call themselves hill country. We used to call them Indian Tamils. I don't know, all of us came from India, one group was called Indian Tamils. Then there's a lot of studies about how census started constructing identities. But one thing we have learned is, rather than looking at identities as very static categories, one needs to look at identities as very evolving categories, changing categories, which has an implication of how we look at the state. So one of our biggest problems have been trying to build a dominance of a centralized state notion in a multi-ethnic society with changing identities. Second, next point is democracy. Sri Lankan has been voting from universal franchise 1931, and of course the plantation workers lost their vote, but it has a very, very weird history, electoral. We have changed regimes regularly in power. 6 armed groups have been absorbed into mainstream politics. Of course, it has broadened the participation. Normally, voting rate is about 85%. We have had parties ranging from Trotskyites to Communist Party, Peking, Moscow, left, right, center left, and also parties based on various identity groups. It's a massive, but very often the debate on democracy is looked at even now as a normative framework. It's like some kind of ideal of a democracy. If you scratch a little bit, it is a democracy of developed countries, liberal democracy, which is discussed as some kind of a norm that can solve the problem. But I would argue, in my work, democratic institution, conflict on societies, that experience I have been with Africa, and we look at separate between democratic institutions and politics, and try and study how democratic institutions get internalized in a particular history with a society with its own social structure, culture, ideology, and so on. There are certain studies like that with, in Delhi, Center for Study of Developing Societies, actually existing democracy. And we have learned a lot, look at that carefully, rather than mouthing some bit of a, recipe of, element of a democracy, and try and see how we can. Now, this is not an argument against democracy, but against importance of looking at history and looking at how these institutions evolve. Third point, social policies as a means of managing state-society relations. Sri Lanka was also known, actually one of the biggest puzzles the people in the 80s when the conflict came had was, it had very high social development indicators, it had been having regular elections, but there was a conflict. In fact, physical quality of life index in Jaffna, which is the heartland of Tamil politics, was second to Colombo. So the whole idea, how does social policies manage state socialization? What does it do to identity conflict? Where do you have to, what are the contradictions? That's a huge another lesson that Sri Lanka can teach. In fact, I would argue that that's becoming much more important in the current situation, which means this questions the straightforward developmentalist approach. If I have this discussion with I'm a political economic background, with my development studies friends, they will say, they will have a whole list of development needs that has to be fulfilled to create peace. But I think there's another dimension that is available. Now, then the final point I must want to, the period in which this Sri Lankan conflict became an armed conflict, almost a civil war, paralleled with the liberalization of the economy. Same election in 1977, which brought a center-right party to power and opened up the economy, it's the same election the Tamil party demanded a separate state. And last 40 years, and that's my current work as writing like a historian, last 40 years we have seen these two processes parallelly going on, and it's interacting, and they able to sustain a conflict actually on one side, and creating numerous problems for a peace. And let me also remind, this was a country, there was a peace process. Now, this is a term of my liberal friends. We have had several rounds of negotiation, but only this one is called a peace process, which was one which was mediated by Norwegians with US, EU, and Japan as co-chairs. And fascinating example to look at, I think we might have a discussion on this later. Fascinating example to look at how does a liberal peace work. And actually it was a failure of that brought in a government went on a military strategy. And today, let me end with this brief comment. A philosopher who has influenced me a lot in terms of when I go towards what I call an instrumentalist world, what to do world. This is Isaiah Berlin, Berlin in one of his essays called Hedgehog and the Fox, this is from a Greek poem, says that hedgehog always has one big answer to the questions. But the fox has different answers to different questions. And often answer to one question contradicts the other. And when I'm now writing to donors, arguing what should be done, I always remember Berlin. There's no one big answer, and actually, please watch out. All those things don't go in a parallelly. And finally, Berlin had been one of the best liberal philosophers who had looked at enlightenment, but also has dissuaded at least my mind from the utopias that enlightenment itself creates.
Thank you, Sunil. We're going to have lots of time for questions and discussion. Our final speaker, Dr. Fitriani, who you all know from the previous session, will now be showing PowerPoint slides.
I have PowerPoint slides because somebody said that my English is not clear enough. So at least you can, I think, and I'm quite sleepy, so I'm staying up late to organize stuff. So you can read it here. So I'm looking at the varieties of peace from the side of women, peace, and security. CSIS is currently undergoing research on women, peace, and security in ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nation, the regional organization in Southeast Asia, of course, and seeing the rising interest on women, peace, and security. This project is ongoing until next year, March. But from the preliminary research, I can tell you that we found the rise of women, peace, and security is because their increase of concern of women involvement in terrorism and violent extremism. And therefore, women are, beside seeing as a problem, and now are increasingly seen as one of the answer. So I will just go on to my slide, and this is the outline. What is Women, Peace and Security Agenda, if you don't know, and the ASEAN progress in adopting it, and the critical challenge and way forward from the preliminary research that we're undertaking. This is just the timeline, and you know the adoption of United Nations Security Resolution 1325 in 2000 is actually give birth of women, peace and security. And next year is a big year because it's a 2 decade of this resolution, and whether it's actually said something of an improvement, that women actually being really actively involved in peace, conflict and security decision making. Previously, women are just combatants, which is not being considered as real combatants when it comes to the conflict resolution. They're only caretakers and very usually considered as a minor actor. And this is the pillars of women, peace and security, and the goal is to actually including women, meaningful participation in this 4 pillars, whether it's prevention, participation, protection, or relief and recovery. It's still an ongoing process because as we all know, the statistic of women included in this peace process is very meager. The goal of this agenda is to achieve positive peace, no violence, or eradicating violence from direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. And the goal is to have the presence of social justice and I guess more women, nothing new. This is the meager number of women participation. And in Asia, it's only 15%. The challenge is, of course, as most country actually experiences the lack of budget. No, when they actually have the budget, they perhaps don't have the monitoring frameworks to see whether the budget, an indicator whether that budget is well implemented. And this is, it's very small, that's why I'm gonna share you, this is the progress that ASEAN has done in women, peace and security. It's starting in 2017 where there is suddenly a joint statement on promoting women, peace and security in ASEAN as a region. And it is pushed by the UN regional dialogue with ASEAN on women, peace and security but in the end of the year. And also donors and dialogue partners that actually contributed to the member state of ASEAN creating a talk on women, peace and security. The first one is supported by Australia in 2018, and then it is the attempt brought further by Ambassador Rezlan Jenny, I hope I pronounced your name right this time, of ASEAN Institute of Peace and Reconciliation to have ASEAN Women and Peace Registry. I think a professor here, one of the included, notable mention. And then member states are actually trying to prove that they are actively involved in this women, peace and security, such as conducting training. Indonesia is conducting training to train diplomats from Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Pacific Island to actually say that conflict, the problem of conflict, of course, can be solved by military process, but then what instill peace is actually is peace negotiation, and diplomats, and hopefully in the future can be, we will have the capacity building done to it's not the movement, but the civil society will have a training on empowering negotiation and women meaningful participation. That is also a joint statement in the ASEAN Regional Forum this year, and the first regional symposium in implementing women, peace and security agenda. But it's sponsored by a dialogue partner of ASEAN, by the US. However, it is still limited to only normative, the issue is just raising awareness. It's normative common ground and issuing, improving capacity building, but not really. There's not really extensive practical cooperation. What do you mean when you actually improve capacity building? What's the impact there, for example? And this is how is it difficult? Because in ASEAN, there's a different pillar, and each pillar actually work in silos. Like the ASEAN Political and Security Community pillar has the human right wing. The human right actually it's a different framework that with ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community pillar that actually hosts the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Right of Women and Children. And also different with the involvement of women in business and how the business can be responsible in actually stopping conflict or actually make peace enduring. This is actually the new trend, having an index of women participation in peace, and it's very small, but it is done by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and the squared table there in the bottom is actually the key indicators of what is a country considered as implementing its women, peace and security agenda. Interestingly, the standard is made not by measuring whether the country have a plan of implementing women, peace and security, but seeing whether they provide security, justice, and inclusion for women. But it actually discouraging countries to have actually national action plan or framework of how they want to actually go from a point that they don't provide any opportunities to women to actually do something of an improvement. So it's just a static index, and whether the index would say something, it's still a homework. It's still, for my understanding, there is an issue of in ASEAN at least, an issue that needs to be resolved if we want to actually make women as part of peace negotiation, or make women as part of a durable peace and sustainable peace situation. There's still an issue of unequal position between men and women in the structure, and the misperception of women, peace and security, as it was conceived by countries, perceived by countries, that any countries that implement women, peace and security agenda is actually a country in conflict. And no country want to be considered as a country in conflict, because once you say the country is in conflict, they're prone as considered as a weak state, as Professor Farah was mentioning, that they would call for international intervention, and no country would want that, I think. The government would still want to be in place. And the issue is no priority agenda in member states, being said that women is only one of the issue that can be agreed by all the 10 member states of ASEAN, because it's not really contradictory. And the last concern is there is still an effort that the endeavor in ASEAN is still unintegrated. This being said, because the issue of women peace involvement in countries, for example, Indonesia and the Philippines, is perhaps different, because Indonesia and Philippines have issue of the woman involvement in violent extremism. Meanwhile, for security and conflict, for example, in Thailand or Cambodia or Vietnam, are different kind of peace involvement there, in terms of how they can actually getting work in a safe place and in manner of safe migration, so on and so forth. I think the homework I want to raise is how we can actually say that women should be integral part of the peace process, and making it a cross-sectoral issue is still something that we need to work on. And I think what it needed is the political commitment of countries. I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks to our three speakers. who raise some issues that are overlapping that I'll just touch on before opening the floor to wider discussion. One of the things that came out with Miriam and Sunil in particular was the challenges of structural change and institutional reform. And something that's, with this focus on varieties of peace since 1997, 1997 was a massive moment of institutional change across the region, which ushered in a wide variety of transitions to peace processes based on very different forms of democratization and decentralization. And in a lot of countries across the region, these democratic pathways were based on structural adjustment programs guided by the World Bank and the IMF, which prescribed neoliberal reforms and often rural reforms that were based on resource efficiency, and they opened up pathways for outside investors and the decentralization of predatory interests around the spoils of decentralization. In places like Aceh and Sri Lanka and East Timor, democratization opened up a whole variety of different opportunities for different people. In East Timor seized the moment of the democratic opening in Indonesia to lodge its claim to a referendum on independence, and the Aceh-style referendum on independence was nowhere near as successful, with Indonesia claiming that Aceh had always constituted an integral part of the Indonesian state and therefore needed to be treated quite differently. So the space for democratic change in Aceh was dictated by the constitutional and political narrative that Indonesia ascribed to the importance of Aceh's role in the Republic. This, of course, led to an eventual closing of democratic space in Aceh, as Achenese narratives about an East Timorese-style referendum didn't gel with security forces' ideas of Indonesian nationalism. So the political space, the political middle ground that would have been available for greater inclusion quickly closed amidst the, as the fighting escalated between the warring parties, leaving peace processes to be internationally brokered. Often these peace processes were very far removed from the oppressive realities on the ground. It was certainly the case in Aceh and in Sri Lanka, and in East Timor in the violence that surrounded the referendum. Decentralization, as the successful example in Aceh has shown, can introduce structural changes that are genuinely inclusive in the form of local direct democratic elections, and that afford an inclusive voice for people in determining their own future. There are other challenges. I remember at the CSIS about a decade ago, Jose Ramos Horta gave a speech about what do we do with East Timor's freedom now that we've got it? What do we do with this democracy, the burden of making democratic choices and carving out peaceful pathways forward in a nascent democracy with very weak state institutions and a very angry and traumatized civil society. The challenges of implementing peace in the absence of strong state institutions, or while efforts are being made to develop democratic institutions, are tremendous and varied, and often depend on the extent to which people are on the same page in having enough political will to move forward toward peace together. The role of women is, as you've rightly pointed out, is a big ASEAN challenge. No women were actually included in the Aceh peace process formally, although many very important women now, Achenese women, are involved in peace-building programs across the region. something about the particularities of state formation in the ASEAN region is that ASEAN states don't want to step on each other's toes because we all share a history of colonization and decolonization, and everybody fears recolonization. So how to pursue engaged non-indifference by having programs that work across borders involving civil society organizations to try and initiate grassroots programs for greater inclusivity without igniting geopolitical tensions. Those were some of the thoughts that came to my mind as I was listening to the three narratives. And now I'd like to open up the floor to wider discussion. Could you please introduce yourself so the speakers know how to address you?
Good afternoon. So my name is Fadil. I'm from Paramadina University. I would like to ask a question to Prof. Miriam and Dr. Fitriani. So my question's about how ASEAN as a regional actors to aggregate its perspective on human security aspect, like women security and counter-violence, for example. So because I see that human security knowledge has been produced by other regions outside in ASEAN, and it's been has a challenge for us. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Should we take another few questions to allow people to formulate their thoughts? Yes.
Hello, my name is Shafira from Search for Common Ground. We're an international NGO working on peace building, and as part of the civil society, I guess, I'd like to ask the panel, how do we combine peace building activities on the ground with more strategic efforts at the elite level to achieve more positive peace that is based on social justice and reconciliation? Because oftentimes we feel that even though we at the grassroots level have peace-building efforts with working with communities, but there's still a certain sense of frustration because oftentimes minority groups or those who are marginalized feel that they still haven't received justice or any kind of maybe acknowledgement or reconciliation from the government. So I'd like to ask on that, and perhaps in terms of women's involvement, I'd like to hear more maybe about women's involvement in peace negotiations and more in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Okay, you have very three good questions that will be topics in themselves. But yeah, let's start with the ASEAN human security. In some countries, human security was very much adopted as a framework, and I think I have to credit the human security discourse for opening up our political processes, particularly our peace negotiations. When we started negotiating with our many armed groups, most of the people who were involved were generals. Then they brought in some ambassadors, but when more and more the question of peace, the question of armed conflict brought in all of these social issues, economic issues, and so on, and sort of had that broader human security framework, then other people came in. For instance, my background is as a peace advocate, doing research on peace, teaching peace, but also being active in the peace movement in the country. And there were several of us from either the academe or from civil society who came in to be part of the negotiating teams in the different armed conflicts, precisely because now we perceive that the problem is not just about hard security, quote unquote, or the traditional notion of security. Of course, in the ASEAN, if you look at the blueprints of the ASEAN, it is very, very comprehensive. But the fact is, a lot of states still are really into traditional security frameworks, and they are able to justify this on many different grounds. Number one, of course, is the hard and fast rule of sovereignty, sovereignty as an overarching norm that governs the politics of these countries, the threats to their sovereignties, and therefore precisely justifying that kind of very, very hard approach, and so on. So it's still an upward climb in terms of really providing that kind of a more holistic view of human security. The rhetoric is there, but in practice, we can see that the states are still very, very protective of their national security, which is still understood in a traditional sense. How do we combine peace-building activities on the ground with elite level? I think most of us will be familiar with the notions of tracks 1, 2, and 3, and we know that CSIS, the ISIS network, they are very much engaged in track 2, meaning they are trying to build that connection between the high level, formal level, and the lower level. But there's a newer concept now, even in feminist discourse, which talks about network advocacy, which really brings that notion of really not just connecting the tracks, or not just the concept of multi-track diplomacy or multi-track peace building, but really seeing how through this kind of feedback loop and dynamic interaction between local, national, or even subnational, national, and global, you're actually able to bring in the grassroots perspectives and empower the grassroots and ensure that what you have as a consequence will be a more durable peace. When we were negotiating with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, we had to contend with a terrible process that happened in the past. It was a Supreme Court decision that said that the agreement that was to be signed at that time did not conduct enough public consultations. We know that in peace negotiations, you do have to be you have to keep some things confidential. But the Constitution required precisely, our democratic Constitution, which we passed in 1987 after the dictatorship, after the Marcos dictatorship, required public consultations in all government policy. So when we came in 2010, that was a terrible time. They were about to sign an agreement. They were already in the place, and Supreme Court said, no, this agreement should be nullified on several grounds, including the ground that there were not enough consultations. So to that extent, when we came in 2010, we ensured that there were a lot of consultations, not only with civil society, but also within government, because government is not monolithic. You have a host of local governments that needed to be consulted, and each local government would have its peculiarity in terms of composition between Muslim and Christian, in terms of development, economic development, etc. So it is indeed very important. In my case, as female chair of the negotiating panel, women came up to me, and that was very good. I did not represent any women's organization. I was appointed by the president, and I represented the president in the negotiations. But it seemed natural for a lot of women to assume that I will carry the women's agenda, and that's the one that I really tried to do to the best of my capacity. And they supported me as well throughout the process. So I feel that that kind of network advocacy, connection between the grassroots and are mutually beneficial for those who are trying to push for this change and the kinds of compromises that will be necessary in a peace agreement, as well as for the people whose voices on the ground will need to be reflected in the kinds of decisions that are being made at the higher level. So I think in our process, in terms of women's involvement, 50% of our negotiating team in government were women. Of course, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front were all men. But because of pressure from the domestic community, the international community, they eventually invited women consultants who are all very good lawyers, and they were not token women at all, so they ended up playing very important roles as well on the other side.
Yeah, let me respond to that question about the grassroots work and how do you link to the work at national level. Now I'm wearing my consultant's hat, right? For 5 years after the war ended, actually I don't like this word victor's peace to characterize Sri Lanka. It's not victor's peace. It's a very traditional way state consolidate territory. We have seen this in history in so many other parts of the world. I argue in my new work, it's a consolidation of territory of the single nationalist state through military means. And there's a stability created, and that has huge implications. Now, then earlier, there was another period before that, about 4 years, when we had the Norwegian mediated negotiations between the LTT and the government. Now, both times, I have been hired by donors, on one hand to support, interact at the national level, and also support what was happening at field level, which is a local level peace building. And actually, I was straddling two worlds. When I started going from the one to the other, this was like, for me, when I came to the national level, there's a certain kind of discussion where I need my political science knowledge of politics of Sri Lanka to understand international relations. When I go to the other level, I go back to my development kind of. I used to work as a consultant for development projects when participatory development was the kind of. I go to that language there. And honestly, two of us, after some time, started fathoming how do you put these two worlds together, right? And quite often it was a linguistic exercise, sometimes that you put on paper. Now, I'm not saying it is not possible, but it lots depend on how the larger political process continued and how the larger political process is pressured from the bottom. I have, for example, I'm now working with the Right to Information Commission. There's a national level and a lot of work going on at that level. And there is a very strong link between the two. We have younger people who are training at local level to how to file cases to the national. Of course, regional journalists have jumped onto the bandwagon very strongly. So we have a process where this national thing is and local are linked. But the other thing that worked in that has been quite a different world. And here I'm sharing my other work is I'm also a researcher for donors, where I study foreign aid, not to implement project, but look at empirical data of how foreign aid has functioned in different conflict situations, mainly with the British ODI. Now I'm sharing that knowledge because the kind of thing this two world thing is kind of knowledge I share at the ODI meetings, started thing. Then a very brief comment about how in our regions, I'm not very popular with single nationalists for this comment, how we protect our sovereignty and vis-a-vis the regional country. I always argue, look, if you want to understand Sri Lankan history, and there are very serious historians that have done that, you have to link with India, southern part of India. In fact, there's one Indian historian which says up to 12th century, you can't understand Sri Lankan history without taking to southern part of India. And actually, quite honestly, only reform of the centralized state that ever happened after Sri Lanka's conflict came was by Indian mediation in 1987, right? So I can see that, and there are certain historians who are writing like that. I can see that continue, but that also forces us to get away from this islanded concept actually, which we draw some kind of lines. Political geographers' new work or critical political geographers is very good in this kind of work, trying to break us through from this bounded concept.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, but going back to this title of Varieties of Peace Asia Conference, and I'm thinking about what makes Asia so special, because I know Umea University would go to Africa, and then you would know what makes Africa special. And I want to share my 2 cents about what makes Asia special in terms of how we perhaps respect human security, to which extent and limit we respect human security, and to what extent we can actually appreciate the grassroots level to be represented or being respected in a national level, right? I would perhaps, every time I do research in terms of how women representation can be improved, or how can we get more human rights become respected and implemented, the issue is like, we are Eastern culture with Eastern value. Of course, we go back to the traditional theory of multiculturalism, which was relatively good, because all culture became respected in a way, because previously the approach is assimilation, where everybody should do the same. Now, isn't it good that we respect this culture, the Eastern culture, whereby, however, in the Eastern culture, there's a respect to the male dominating power, as well as the government, or before the government exists, before the state exists, the modern state as we know, it was the king and queens, right? These are kind of the culture that this region are actually brought up to. I have this kind of discussion with some diplomat for one of the ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, saying whether democracy is actually compatible with Southeast Asia. Seeing that we are very much prefer to have benevolent king or benevolent ruler that would respect, in a way that respect the culture there is, such as religion, specific religion, or special caste system, for example. That said, the first question, how is the human security respected in ASEAN? Of course, with the Eastern value, not really. We don't respect human as such, but we respect the society. So I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the country would choose to have stability and peace of stability first, to have reconciliation, rather than pushing for human rights and justice. That's a bitter truth, or yeah, maybe depend on whose truth is being told. And how, in terms of grassroots to the national level, I think in my issue, women, peace and security, we see the differences between how the Western cultures see women and peace and security, more women in the security forces, more women in the peacekeeping forces, right? And then when you go to this Asian country, at least Southeast Asian country, how many of this women, peace and security actually translated to increased number of women of the police and the military? I think the Philippines is an excellent example of successful example, because of Magna Carta. Women actually enforce the government to have a minimum number of women. Then going there in the ground, I talked to those women saying that minimum number of women actually become the limitation, because you have the prescriptive number. There you go. So I guess there we have it. What's so special about Asia, the varieties of peace in Asia? Maybe we have the Eastern value. You like it or not?
Controversial words. You don't have to limit yourself to questions. So if you have comments, then please, this is a discussion time. So let's take one from down the back, the guy with the blue suit and red shirt here.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you so much for the insights. My name is Salvador Hilme. I'm a tenured academic from the Institute for History at Leiden University. My question is about, well, actually it's more of a comment about the East Asian values debate. Perhaps I'd like to ask your clarification about this, because my understanding, and coming from the human rights literature, coming from IR literature, there has been a lot of historical literature already from Steve Jensen, for example, in his book, The Making of Human Rights, my colleague from Yale, Samuel Moyne. Basically, Global South diplomats were at the forefront of human rights diplomacy in the context of decolonization. So my argument, and this is the emerging argument in the humanities and in the social sciences of human rights, is that basically East Asian values debate were being used to consolidate the regimes of those which are non-democratic. So I just wanted to ask for clarification about whether or not this East Asian values debate, East Asian values are unique and basically very much inherent in East Asia, well in fact, scholarly literature says otherwise.
Hello, Dr. Fitria. I think I'm very interested. Just wants to comment about this Southeast Asia when the China militarized it, and since there is a conflict, then maybe women can think something for contribution, right? When it comes to the China militarizing it, there are a lot of Asian, countries are going for that their own, boundary, and whether the navigation conduct, whether the women can be involved with the China, with the Asians, when it comes to the disaster, conduct in those free zone in China, South China Sea.
Opportunity. Yeah, I just want to ask to our fellow from Sri Lanka. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, because I have a friend from Sri Lanka when I was working in Middle East, so we always discuss regarding Sri Lanka and Indonesia conflict. As long as what I have read in the news that since 1948 until 2018 last year, the conflict in Sri Lanka is still the same issue, fighting between Buddhist and Muslim. That always the same issues. So do you think who's behind the scenario? It is politician, it is third country, or it is society? Actually, Indonesia itself, we have the same problem before, but now the issue of religion, I think Indonesia is much better. We already solved that problem. If it is happening, I think it's not that massive, but before it was massive when the issue of religion is always being, so many victims and etc. will be, happening. Now I just want to know, again, my question is, who's behind the scenario? It is third country, politician, or it is society itself? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for asking the question, East Asian value. I think, yeah, of course. I raised the issue of multicultural exceptionalism. And I think it's good that East Asian value is, if you like, to push of more human rights. But the question again from the feminist literature is always, who's human rights? How many of these diplomats are female, right? And in terms of that, previously the increasing number of female diplomats in Southeast Asia is only recently. And that was actually the increase of literature or multiculturalism in Europe was also brought by those people, migrants from the colonial areas. When they go to the colonial ruler and they say, because the colonial ruler always said that you have to assimilate because our culture is the best. And the multicultural argument was that not really, because your culture actually demean our human rights and dignity, so our culture is the best. And therefore, there's a notion of multicultural exceptionalism. So we have to respect the multicultural. But to which extent this culture actually only honor a certain spectrum of society, the haves, the strong, the connected, so on. That's my question. In terms of Matthias' question, how women would feature in the China militarizing, I think, no, it doesn't feature at all. It's a discussion that already ongoing in CSIS in terms of how this big power relation influenced the region, whether it influenced any issue particular. Yes, the issue is returning is big power politics. that's the return. And unfortunately for this, some people said this soft issue is not really of importance anymore. Sorry to say. No, it's not really an important. Women issue will not be a center in terms of China militarizing, if I get your question correct.
Yeah, in response to your question, I think basically when you look at Sri Lanka's conflict, whether Muslims or Tamil, one of the things that my institute has been working for a long time, often this gets interpreted as conflict between homogeneous groups, kind of ethnic groups, ethnic conflict. Now that we have questioned a lot. Even in the case of the Tamil issue, it doesn't fit into the empirical data because Tamil political struggles involve number of armed groups. First, I have lost most of my Tamil friends who have been politically active, I have lost because of LTT, right? So even if you look at empirical data of the war at that time, you can't generalize it as ethnic conflict or something like that. So it's much more complex than that, and actually really these primordialist kind of ideas of ethnicity, which is actually a colonial construction, get easily used by everybody, and it's like a homogeneous group. Now with regard to the Muslim population, you see, when you say Muslim, there's a variety of groups. Religion is one, but we have Malays, Boras, Gujaratis, Ceylon Moors, Indian Moors, and they have come to the country for centuries. Waves and waves have come, In fact, the last kingdom of Kandy had a specialist section for Muslims because they were involved in trading. When Portuguese came, they got dislodged to Central, right? So that diversity has to be kept in mind. Otherwise, we are constructing categories, constructing a narrative which doesn't do justice what's happening. But on the issue what happened recently on the Easter Sunday, I think on one hand, a lot of the things that I have written, the event as such does seem to have a link with some of the more extreme currents of global Islamic movement, the event as such. But the important thing to look at is eastern province of Sri Lanka, where there is a Tamil-speaking Muslim population, right? So actually when Tamils demanded a separate state linking north and east, this had been a debate within the Tamil politics. Tamil always say they speak for Tamil-speaking people, which the Muslim population in the east did not accept. So over the years during the war, there have been lots of violence incidences in the east, right? In fact, a massacre in a mosque where 100 and odd people were killed. The villagers are one Muslim, one Hindu, like that. So there are lots of in the eastern. So there is definitely a trend of more radical, more extremist currents of Islamic in one particular town in that area. Katankudi. It is from where some of the people came. But the really sad part is, and this I've just been in Sri Lanka for two or 3 weeks, I'm fighting with my friends, because single extremist nationalist discourses link all Muslims with this whole event. And there's some kind of a concept of Wahhabism and sweeping all Muslim population with that brush. It's like it inevitably should lead to violence. Right? I mean, if you look at history of Sri Lanka's religious practices, there's a variety of ways. So I can share because some of my friends are writing about this. And obviously this is a singular nationalist discourse. And there have been reaction from the state, have been usual security reaction. And a lot of Muslims have been affected. I have lawyers who are regularly going to the field, So only thing is, at the moment, then also there's also complication of Muslim political parties. There are a number of political parties, not one. Earlier tradition was to be with the two main parties, now there are a number of. So it's very difficult, these I like to explain, there are no root causes. This is going on Berlin, right? The phenomenon has multiple layers of causes, right? But the unfortunate reaction is root causes, legitimizing certain kind of work, and I'm worried whether given that, given the dominant opinion is that whether Sri Lanka might alienate another group. Hopefully, I mean, you know, the presidential election, 16th of November. So everything now has got kind of into the cauldron, right? So politics definitely plays a role, no doubt. But which politics, which groups is a much more complicated issue.
Yes, just you with the red jacket.
Thank you. It's quite interesting to know more about Sri Lanka because I did research about indigenous people in Borneo, and I found it's quite similar. Like at the moment in Borneo, there is a conflict between Dayaks and Maduris, and also Maduris with Malays, and then 2 weeks ago, it's conflicts between Dayak and Bugis. And actually, there is a lot of transmigrants in Borneo that they have their own tribes, and then they get a conflict with each other, whether the peace agreements already implemented in Borneo, and also the peace monument already there, but they still have a conflict. So sometimes I get confused, like why the peace agreement has been done there, but formally, but informally, they still have a conflict. Like what happened today, 2 weeks ago, last week ago, in the capital of Indonesia, actually, in the east of Kalimantan, Penajam. So there is a conflict between the tribes as well, between the Bugis and also the Dayaks. They burned their houses and kind of like that because of the child of the tribes has been killed by another tribes, and the conflict is going on until now. And I thought that in Varieties of Peace that I could write about the post-conflict paper, actually. But then when I read that news, and I was just thinking like, oh my God, it still happens. So the conflict is still going on, whether the peace process has been done. Then how about in Sri Lanka, if it's happened? Because I got a friend here, Deshani, and she's from Sri Lanka. And last night we talked a lot about the tribes in Sri Lanka as well. And we share a lot about the conflicts there, and it also still happens, the conflict whether the peace agreement has already been done there. So what is the best solution for them to prevent the peace in the future, to prevent the conflicts for the peace in the future? And seems with the Professor Miriam's that we already discussed about that as well, that you see in the north of Philippines, there is also the indigenous people. And is there like the good communication, like you said, like if we have like traditional communications, heart by heart, maybe the peace will be exist because they are from the tribes, not from the government sides or for the clever, smart people like that or educated people. So they have to be like, in the forum or kind of like dialogue or communications. But how about in the north of Philippines or in Sri Lanka? Do you use like traditional dialogue, like heart by heart, like the tribes of the head of the tribes meet face to face to the community, so to prevent these conflicts longer? Thank you very much.
Okay, we're running out of time, so let's let Miriam start because she had a comment from the preceding question, and then you can wrap up.
Just a quick response to your question about the indigenous population. Yes, they do have traditional mechanisms by which they are able to deal with their own conflicts. So, for instance, in the tribal communities in the north, they have their own peace pacts between tribes, which evolve to a certain extent to become multilateral pacts, not only bilateral pacts, by way of keeping the peace within their own territories. So it is to that extent that taking a look at all of these subnational forms of mediation that are taking place and the key actors who are playing these kinds of role, although we may say that they are still male-dominated institutions, because when we talk about tribal councils, for instance, they're mostly, they're often almost 100% male. But we can see that through time, more and more women are precisely playing that kind of mediation role as well. So it's very important to be able to see these mechanisms that exist on the ground, where actual mediation is actually happening, and see how that sort of builds your pool of mediators and your pool of experiences to be able to build the peace bottom up and not just trying to do it from the top. So that's my brief answer. I don't know if I captured all the points that you wanted to raise, but yes, these are very interesting to look at these subnational processes. I just had a short comment about the East Asian debate, which is of course quite an old debate, but still, I mean, it can be resuscitated anytime, but we can see that in the 1990s, the time of the democratization, where a lot of Southeast Asian countries entered into that kind of a wave of democratization, 80s, 90s. This was some kind of the counter-narrative to that democratization by raising the flag about East Asian values. And to a certain extent, that has died down, and we saw that there has been some forward movement. Human rights commissions have been put up in most of the ASEAN countries, a difficult struggle, not easily accepted by a lot of these countries, but eventually they were able to set this up. But what's constraining now, most of this human rights work that has already grown in terms of human rights movements in the different countries are the politics of the current state. They're the ones that currently impinge all the gains that have been made by human rights activists from all over Southeast Asia. Not so much because of East Asian values, but clearly, basically, for basic political agenda that they have, and most often it's about regime survival or their own personal survival. And yes, the Global South has been a major actor in advancing global human rights campaigns. The Global South was particularly active in putting in economic, social, and cultural rights, which is one excuse to get away from civil and political rights. But if you look at the history of the Convention on ECOSOC, it was the Global South that pushed that, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Indigenous rights, which led to the declaration, the Convention on the Declaration on IP Rights, were really pushed forward by a lot of indigenous communities, both from the north, the American Indians as well as in Canada, but certainly working with the indigenous communities of the Global South. There's a very interesting question about women in China. I'm sure a lot of common ground between the women of China and the women of Southeast Asia on women's issues. But yes, doesn't mean that women will be the first to defend the peace. A lot of women might be the first to, on the basis of nationalism and one that is hyped up, jingoism that's hyped up by the state. All the fake news, for instance, that can come in through the media to mobilize their own citizens to be able to, justify, say, attacking or going to war. I mean, it can happen both ways, and men and women can fall victim to that kind of jingoism that states will employ. So we do need to be careful and keep in touch with all the women so that we'll be able to read through all these machinations from state elites.
Yeah, to your question very briefly, I've had to deal with this often when I'm, especially my consultant's hat, right? My general principle has been, when you come to conflict, I have studied 2 or 3 conflicts in fairly great detail, and 2 of my friends have studied anthropologists, have spent 2 or 3 years studying one. Very often things that are called, there are conflicts, have very different kind of conflicts, very different types, which we put under one name but different. And very often big ones, which are talked as ethnic conflicts or things like that, are very organized things. They're not unorganized groups fighting. There's very much a strong organized element behind, right? And that we straightforward go to the political issues. In fact, there's an interesting study on Muslim-related violence from 1915 now, everyone is showing that organized element, right? And various actors are there. Then when it comes to what to do, I have to be careful here. I have long ago forgotten about idea there's one big answer. Again, my Berlin, right? For these things. But one principle I have tried to follow, and there are a few successful projects. You see, when all these conflicts are there, not that there are no interaction between different identity groups. The basic question of build up on the existing relations. For example, one of the fascinating things studies I have done is, I've studied some well-known religious institutions, which are from different religions, Sufi shrines, Catholic, and actually when you look at people who are worshipped, then these places have some belief among people that these places have special powers. And you go and see who is worshipping, people from variety of religions, not one religion. In fact, for religion in society, religion, not the organized religion, not the religion that get institutionalized. Religious practices in society is very eclectic. It's not unusual for Buddhists to worship Hindu gods. It's very eclectic. And I believe however much the conflicts are there, those practices do exist. And in certain places, we have tried to build on the basic. But I'm not saying that's a big answer that will expand into forming peaceful Sri Lanka. No. We are, as somebody long ago told us, we make history not under conditions of our own choosing, right? And it is in the context looking for niches, looking for little strategies. I've done wonderful work with theater people, which are theater groups who work in 2 or 3 languages like that. So that's my
Closing remarks. Just want to say that the reason I raised the Eastern value is just to make the discussion, live. And it works, thanks. And thank you, Professor, sorry. But thank you, Professor, for reminding us the durability of peace that has been achieved so far is actually really being challenged in, at least in Asia, Southeast Asia, is because of the political agenda. At least in Indonesia, is the return of identity politics, and how the people in power are trying to stay in power. And it actually doesn't matter whether it's a male or female, because talking about women, the women that raise up to the rank of the decision maker of women, President Megawati, Filipinos, two women, and Thailand as well, I'm not going to mention other countries' name, but they're always linked with something, whether that's is actually, the variety of peace, that is the peace that we actually having that would actually sustain our peace so far. So I still argue, although it's for, making the debate livelier, I just want to share that's important for us to be here to show what's so specific about Asia and the peace in Asia, rather than focusing on, yes, every area has its conflict, and maybe some has root causes from religion, some has root causes from the regimes of survival, but how is Asia actually interconnected, and we can have different color perhaps for Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. And as we approach the end of our panel, I guess I'll just reflect on the history, on the future of varieties of peace in the context of the shift toward authoritarianism and neoliberal globalization across the region. As we enter into unknown territory, new varieties of peace are opening up, and old ways that were possible in the context of the early years of the transition toward democracy and decentralization might not be possible. So, for example, when we were in Rio a few months ago and we were talking with rights activists around plantation agriculture and land disputes, we asked them if they ever feared for their lives, and they said, oh, no, we don't play that game anymore. We don't get arrested. We don't get tortured. Now we just get bought by corporations. So there's the terrain's constantly shifting, and new alliances are forming across borders, new new possibilities are opening, even as old ones are closing. And with that, let's move on to the rest of the sessions.
Yes, thank you so much. The whole panel, I think you've really given us a lot of food for thought for the coming days. And I think, I mean, it gives us more questions and issues and themes that we need to research further. I mean, I'm not going to summarize the whole panel, but some themes that I think that have come up that are really, and come up again and again. One thing is that not all good things necessarily go together. That sometimes if you push for peace, it also means that, well, there can be a backlash on democracy. And the other way around as well. I mean, efforts to promote democratization also means a risk of increased violence, as we have seen in Hong Kong and other places. So, and I think, I mean, a lot of things have come up, like inclusion, inclusion of whom? I mean, not only rebel groups, but women, different types of women promoting different agendas, civil society and other bottom-up approaches, and traditional authorities, where is the role for that? And so I think, yes, this brings, I mean, also brings back to the issue of peace for whom, whose peace is promoted, and that I think we can bring with us for the coming days. So thank you very much for this panel. And as a token of appreciation, I will also give you some Swedish sweets from the northern part of Sweden, the cloudberry sweets.